I'm going to start out our discussion of the crisis of the late Roman Republic by just explaining briefly some of the key features of the Republic itself. First of all, the word Republic is actually a very nondescript term. In Latin, res publica just means the public thing, right? And that's how the Romans referred to it. It sort of encapsulates all of the social and political and economic and, in fact, cultural features of the Roman civilization, right? That all of that was all of that was part of this term republic as the Romans conceived of it. It was rather all encompassing. It's similar in its own way to the Greek word polis, which we've talked about. And was thought of in a similar fashion, right? The Romans were very proud of this thing they had created. It was created when they overthrew, or rather escaped from, a monarchy, which was sort of headquartered up here in the northern part of Italy. Rome is further down here in the west central part of Italy. But they were under, the rule of a kingdom based in Etruria, or it was a kingdom of the people called the Etruscans, who were somewhat different culturally and linguistically from the Romans. But when they overthrew that and established their independence, they were very proud of that and remembered this in sort of quasi legendary stories. That they told and retold over the centuries, right? That contained within that ideas about what was important to the Romans, the values that animated them. And so we need to take those things into account as well. Let's talk about the social aspects of this, right? So from its earliest period, and the establishment of the Republic dates to around 500 BCE or so. We can't, identify an exact year of this, but that's, I think that's kind of where we can assume it began from archaeological evidence and some of the textual evidence that we have, which is pretty scant. But anyway, from the early period, there were these elites, and they were the largest landholders. They established themselves as the governing part of the society, and the wealthiest and most prestigious part. They were called by the Romans patricians. And the thing that the patricians wanted and considered themselves to have more than anything else was what they called honor, right? And there are various Latin words for this. The word dignitas in Latin, which is where we get the English word dignity, that was one, but there were others. Honor itself comes from the Latin word honos. Honor meant that they had standing, they had a reputation. This could be earned in one's lifetime by winning a battle as a military commander, or by doing some great service to the Republic, like serving in a key government position, especially as a consul or something like that, doing something to bolster one's reputation, and then it could be then transferred from generation to generation. And over a few generations, these patricians claimed to have, a corner on the market of honor, right? Those who lacked honor, by contrast, and usually also lacked wealth, though there were some very wealthy people among this group, were called the plebeians. And we're talking about, a split of maybe 10% of the population or less being patricians and the rest of it being plebeians. And of course, there were a lot of divisions among the plebeians. Some were wealthy, some were very poor. But the key aspect here is that they lacked honor. The patricians claimed the privilege, or we might say the right, though that's more of a modern term, to rule, to make decisions, and much of the government was set up to favor patricians holding positions. Now, there were these aspects where the power was shared, and this was partly through a system of what the Romans called patronage and clientage, right? So powerful elite men with wealth and prestige and honor would take clients. That is, they would kind of accept the homage, or the loyalty from those who lacked wealth and honor. and these people would back them politically and do their bidding, so to speak, and the clients got the patronage, the help to advance in various ways politically or socially from their wealthy patrons, right? So patricians, to kind of make this general, patricians would take on plebeian clients. Now there were that wasn't always the case. In some cases, sort of less prestigious patricians would become clients to more prestigious patricians, or there may have been even some later on, at least in the late Republic, where some plebeians had risen to high status. They would take on clients as well, right? But in general, there was this system, and in some cases, clients could even be adopted by their patrons and be given inheritance and kind of take their place as what the Romans called the paterfamilias, or the head of the family, the familia. And I don't want to get into kind of the details there. Okay, those are a couple of important things, though. The government itself of the Roman Republic was quite complicated by modern standards. Laws were made by assemblies, and there were several assemblies. The most prestigious of these, the ones with the kind of highest responsibilities traditionally, were dominated by patricians. But there was, from the mid 5th century on, an assembly that was made up either largely or mostly of plebeians. And I say largely or mostly because the makeup of this changed over time and its purposes changed over time. And so there was some competition between these different assemblies. The most prestigious body, though, in the Roman government was called the Senate. The Senate technically did not have the power to make laws, but it did have it was the de facto, like, rubber stamp, not rubber stamp, that's not the right word. It was the one that gave approval to any decision made by Roman officials. It was rare that a magistrate, for instance, in whatever position, even consul, which is the highest position in the magistrates, would go against the wishes of the Senate. To become a member of the Senate, one, at the beginning had to be a patrician, but as plebeians were, elected to these magistrate positions over time, some of them became senators as well. But pretty much to be part of the Senate, you had to have held a high position in the Roman government, which meant you had to have honor, you had to have wealth, you had to have clients, and this gets complicated. The Senate becomes a place where there's a lot of debate and a lot of rivalry, and this is important for the crisis that we're looking at specifically, which is what's called the Catilinarian conspiracy, where Cicero, who was a plebeian, but he was what they called a novus homo. That means a plebeian who was the first in his family line to rise to the position of consul, right? To rise to this really high rank, the highest rank in the Roman government. And so he was a member of the Senate, as having held these positions, but he was not necessarily respected by the other senators. And so when he gives these speeches in the Senate, that's something that's kind of hanging over his head, is that he lacks the honor that many of these other senators do. Catiline, by contrast, was from an old patrician family, and they trusted him more, even though he had a bad reputation, right? So those are things to consider. So the magistrate positions, and I'm not going to go through all of these, the highest one was called the consul. There were always two consuls in Rome. Two, because they would act as a check on each other. The Romans abhorred the idea of monarchy. They had overthrown a monarchy to become a republic. They didn't want to go back to it, and so there were always two consuls. They were elected annually to 1-year terms, and for most of Roman history, the tradition was that a man would only hold a consulship once in his life, or that a long period, maybe 10 years or more, would pass between consulships. And so it was never the case, at least not until the late Republic, that a Roman held the consulship for multiple years in a row, right? That changes in the late Republic, and that's one of the power dynamics that we have to be aware of. So I'll talk about that in the next video. However, most of these magistrate positions could only be held, or were most commonly held, I should say, by patricians. There were some plebeians even fairly early on who gained access to the consulship, but that was pretty rare. And the plebeians kept pressing for more say in government, right? This is similar to what happened in the Greek polis in the Archaic Age, where the Mesoi, as they were called, the kind of lower landholders, were saying, look, if we're going to fight in the army, we want to say in the government, right? And so they created these kind of citizen assemblies. Well, the Roman Republic followed a similar trajectory. This is the creation of the plebeian council, was one, but then the establishment of this office called tribune was another. A tribune was a plebeian magistrate office. It was supposed to be only given to plebeians. In the late Republic, some patricians did seek election as tribunes because they saw this as a path to power. This was extended to plebeians. There were several of these elected, and the number changed over time. By the late Republic, there were 10 tribunes elected every single year. The tribune had a kind of veto power over anything the consuls did. If this was not in the interest of the plebeians, the tribune could say that's not going to happen. That decree is null and void. And the tribunes could even kind of issue their own decrees. They had this power called imperium, like the consuls did, which was the power to issue executive orders. There's this kind of back and forth between consuls and tribunes in this period. Some would be very ambitious men, and we'll talk about this, use the office of tribune to try to come to power in ways that really hadn't been conceived of before the late Republic. There's one other magistrate position we should mention, and this is the office of dictator. This was not a normal thing, but if the Romans faced some kind of crisis, they could suspend the government effectively, do away with the assemblies, do away with all of the magistrates, and give all power to one man whom they called the dictator. And the dictator was limited only by a 6-month traditional term of office. And so if a man was appointed as dictator, that would expire at the end of 6 months. It was not out of the question for that to be extended, but it traditionally was not. The idea was that, the most efficient government was the government of rule by one person, but that is, of course, dangerous. That's going to lead to monarchy and autocracy, and the Romans didn't like that. So this did happen a few times in Roman history. Those who were elected dictator early in the history of the Republic tended to become almost legendary figures, noted for their willingness to lay down this huge power once they had solved the crisis. Okay, and so traditionally this was just a very limited thing. One other thing we should say about the Republic briefly is that it undertook a program of expansion almost from the beginning, right? By the end of the 5th century, Rome was already fighting against its neighbors, expanding into other parts of, first of all, Italy, and over the course of a couple of centuries, the Romans defeated their neighbors and incorporated their lands into their possessions, turning much of this into plantations that were dominated by patricians, run by patricians. This is how the patricians came to just this fabulous wealth. And because the Romans fought so many wars, they took war captives as slaves, and much of this land was worked by slave labor. And so the Romans, were able to use that to their advantage. This did create some problems, some inequalities that were key to the understanding of the crisis of the late Republic, and I'll talk about that later. Maybe the most important wars in the history of the Roman Republic, though, were these things called the Punic Wars. In fact, all of Roman history, this is kind of the definitive conflict. This was fought against the city of Carthage, which is down here in North Africa, modern-day Tunisia. Carthage was a colony that was founded by people from Phoenicia over here, right? But they had settled there and become independent over the centuries. And Carthage was a major maritime power, a key trade center. Rome fought a series of wars against Carthage and gradually took over Carthaginian territory. Initially, Carthage had held these islands out in the Western Mediterranean like Sicily and Sardinia and Corsica and the Balearic Islands over here. And Rome, as they defeated Carthage, gained all of this territory and really came into their own, fighting against a rival power who were their near equals in kind of the amount of resources they could muster for war. Rome then took advantage of the weakness of Greece and Macedonia in the waning days of the Hellenistic period, where these kind of rump kingdoms that were established with the breakup of the Empire of Alexander the Great were suffering, were under, the leadership of really incapable people, and Rome kind of intervened there, much actually as Philip and Alexander had done with the Greek polis at the end of the classical age, and gradually took over that territory too. And then by the time of the Catilinarian conspiracy, the crisis we're talking about, Rome held all of Italy, these islands out here, most of Iberia, the tip of North Africa, and they were kind of fighting down here to gain more territory, and had come into possession of all the way up to the Alps, really, and then were the governors of most of the Greek-speaking lands as well, including the eastern coast of the Adriatic Sea. Right, so Rome had a lot of territory, and this territory caused them some problems. So we'll talk about that next time as we continue to discuss the crisis of the late Republic.